if you think about the cataclysmic changes, at times society like radically transformed, right? Like we're always the victims of the moment. We always use our own experience to kind of judge how big something can get or the nature of the shift of the transformation. And so we might, if we're older, we might kind of remember the internet. We might think about Web 2. There's hedge funds that say, hey, this is a big deal. It's like, 19th century technology, cars and telephones and what have you. But I actually think if you look at it through a historical lens, which, most historians aren't really incentivized to look at current things. They kind of consider that current events. But if you suspend disbelief and you look at crypto as a historical trend, it matches a lot of things that we've seen repeatedly. And one of the ways I always looked at history, one of the biggest transformations, there's a couple like long scale transformations in Western civilization, like Roman Empire to disillusionment to the Middle Ages building back up, and then the Renaissance that kind of unwound all of that, hierarchical structure, hegemony, whatever you want to call it, and decentralized it. That was a massive change, the most recent massive change 500 years ago, and it very much defines the world we're in today. We call it, early modern studies, and we're in modernity, regardless of what postmoderns might think. Like our structures are modern, and so that was a radical transformation. And when you look at crypto, it has a lot of similarities to that. And so these changes in history, what happened? I see, history is a pendulum swinging back and forth. Maybe it just goes back and forth. Maybe it ratchets up, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But the basic idea is that you have periods of aggregation where power and resources are, consolidated. Think of it as total addressable market. And then you have periods of kind of unwinding of that, dissolution, decentralization, redistributization. And so at the end of the Middle Ages, that world was fundamentally hierarchical and it was fundamentally permissioned. And the threads I use as a historian to kind of, you can't look at everything at the same time. So I put on a couple of different lenses. I put on one lens around value and one lens around communication, and then another lens around identity, which is kind of the sum of the two. And so with value, your medieval world was hierarchical. Value was concentrated in the hands of few. You actually didn't have rights to own certain things or to spend money as you might like to. And the same thing with communication. Information, the idea to change this wouldn't have occurred to you. Information was, held in actual physical documents, and those were protected. You had to go to a place like those archives I was talking about and have permission, like letters of introduction, to get to it. And so you couldn't really have a spread of ideas. And then finally, identity, had largely been static. You were a farmer, your parents, their parents, their parents, their parents, their parents, their parents, about 4 more sets of those. So it wouldn't have occurred to you to do anything else other than what you had known. And so one of the questions is what changed? And so the nature of the change was, like I was saying, really around communities, and they used 2 different types of technologies, and it was this ledger-based technology. The Renaissance means rebirth, and one of the key words they say is ad fontes, or to the sources. They went back to the sources and rediscovered things, painting and perspective, but also technology, accounting technology. And so they rediscovered something that had been used in North African communities, and Pliny talks about it, and it was this crazy idea of ledger-based accounting, which sounds obvious to your listeners, but previously it would be centralized reconciliation every single time you had a transaction, and they rediscovered this ledger-based accounting, which was like magic to them. It was like when they rediscovered the zero, right? It was like you could have speed and liquidity and have a flourishing of financial fundamentals that we hadn't seen for hundreds of years. It meant debit and credit, and it increased velocity, and all sorts of magic happened around that. And then at the same time, there was also another technology around permissionless communication, which was the printing press. And the printing press, we think of it, it was radical in terms of it decentralized information, where previously you never would have seen a document. It was handwritten and cost, a year's salary or 10-year salary, depending upon where you were. Now you could see a document that cost, the price of a chicken or a dinner, and it spread ideas, and the ideas weren't able to be controlled. Some people tried to KYC the printers and register them, but essentially you could set up a print shop in the back of a store and, have 1,000, documents and run around to a fair with them and spread it out. And so that was... The printing press was radical. It was the birth of mass media, and it really communicated new ideas. And the magic behind that wasn't just that the ideas were interesting, but it was the idea that they were new. After 1,000 years of stasis, it was the idea of something being new. And so that was those two things combined. And the thing that was printed, mostly, we think about it in terms of like Gutenberg's Bible or long academic disputations, but that wasn't the case. They were really images. Most of the things printed were, single pieces of paper, these big broadsheets or Flugschriften, and they were copper etchings or wood cutting, which is a new technology. So the art, watch closely, was like endemic, baked into the technology, and people
Yeah.
communicated through these images. And these images said, hey, the medieval hierarchical world was fundamentally illegitimate. This guy named Martin Luther, who came along and had some philosophy and theology around it, made really good use of the printing press and basically said lots of those authority figures were illegitimate and just toppled that hierarchy. And around that, you had this unwinding and then a recreation at every fundamental level. And so people left the farms, they could start new businesses. There's a birth of capitalism, proto-mercantilism, however you want to describe it. And so a couple things happened in that literally changed the nature of identity, or forked, their identity or their reality. They said another thing was actually possible other than the thing that you're currently experiencing. So medieval you was just like you today, fundamentally permissioned in terms of value and communication identity, but you didn't really know it. And then all of a sudden something like extraneous came in and said, hey, you're in this fishbowl, you can get out and hop in the sea and swim around. And it was radical. It toppled hierarchy, it forked, power, political, economic. And the art was key to the movement, not just in terms of like, Medici collecting different things to, grossly, buy their way into society. They literally used the art to communicate these messages. And even if you couldn't read, you could kind of read with your family and friends at a pub or tavern in this communal event and say, hey, there's this other alternative community and we can build this from the ground up, which was radical. So it wasn't just that power was hierarchical, so too was what had not just monetary value, but worth in terms of culture. And so in that
Yeah.
sense, there's like religious and there's non-religious, there's sacred and there's profane, and only this stuff was worth, communicating through art. And Luther and these guys came along and said, no, all this reality, you didn't have to be off in a monastery. You could work with your friends and your family in a community, and that was good and it had meaning, and you could do that like doing a good job in this society, in this world. And so that was fundamentally transformative, partially because it wasn't just better technology, it was decentralized technology, which meant you couldn't stamp it down. So it's one other key thing to keep in mind. There were a variety of renaissances before the last one, and they'd pop up, they'd bubble, they'd simmer for a little bit, and then they were smashed down because they didn't use decentralized technology. The last one was so successful that it eclipsed all the others. So we just kind of remember that. When we say the word Renaissance, we think back, 15th century Italy, blah, blah, blah. And so when I look at crypto, I say, okay, we see very similar things. We see a radical transformation of how we communicate value in a decentralized way, right? Again, ledger-based technology down to the details, which is insane. And the same thing with communication. And so we think, because we're victims of our own age, that the internet is the printing press. That's not the case. That's kind of a false start or a false fork. There's the promise of that, but because we didn't have value baked in, it ended up centralizing. And so now with Web3, or whatever you'd like to call it, we're actually having true decentralized communication. When you put these two things together, it's a repeat of the last Renaissance. Just one last thing, and then I'll take a breath. If you play the story forward, that was great. There's pluralism, creation, flourishing, reworking of society and culture at every conceivable level: military, economic, work, society, family, art, identity. And then over the next 500 years, the pendulum of history kind of swings back and we start aggregating again: birth of the nation state, consolidation, Bretton Woods, and we go up through here. And now we're essentially in the same medieval kind of hierarchical construct. And that may sound crazy, but I could take you on a journey to show you how medieval you are without knowing it. Or you could just look at some of the value concentration, if nothing else. And so now we're faced with these two new types of technology, which have been very slow, very chaotic, up and down, volatile. That's not a mark of them not working. That's a leading indicator that they do tend to work. And so pulling those threads, value, communication, and now identity, I see very strong similarities. The exception in how they're different, though, is where after the Renaissance, when things reaggregated, one of the tools was, identity, getting you to think in a certain way, particularly, but also rights, property rights. You could take your ledger with, counting and move that around. You could take a printed document and idea and move that around, but you couldn't take a piece of property around. That remained physically static in a location, and so that was one of the tools that they used for reaggregation. And so in this crypto renaissance, we have, on-chain property rights, NFTs, not just as pixelated cats, but on-chain property rights for synthetic things and IRL things, which I think these aren't just arithmetic. They're not like additive. They're hyperbolic. So So very bullish on that. That's the thesis in 2 minutes, if that's helpful.
Wow. First of all, not a 2-minute thesis. That's a 10-minute thesis, but I loved the whole thing. As a podcast host, there's this like fine balance between jumping in and letting the guests really share their knowledge. And I was just listening to that, and that was great. If you're listening to that right now, you might need to rewind that back and listen to it again. But that was really interesting, Josh. So I have so many questions. I kind of just need to start back at the top here. But you mentioned so much. You talked about access, ownership, status, and all those things in like the Renaissance, the medieval time, being like things that were being changed. Access changed, access to what you could read, ownership changed, and your status around what you could be changed. And I see so many similarities as you were just talking. Just my brain was just thinking of all these different NFT examples, how NFTs give you access to new groups. And right now, what we see online, I mean, you tell me what you think. Like, is it just, are these initial takes at NFTs just pure experiments? But you mentioned at the beginning of the pod, like, it's not just another picture of a cat or another picture of a monkey. They're actually representing really significant changes in what can be, and these initial NFTs are actually just don't get lost in the cartoon nature of them or the childlike, the toy-like aspect of the NFT, because they really represent fundamental shifts in how communities and ownership and property rights can really be represented in society. So that's what I'm hearing from you when you started talking through some of that.
You're listening to the Unstoppable Podcast, the go-to place for everyone to learn about the latest innovations in Web3, NFTs, and the decentralized web. Welcome to the metaverse.